The Clay County, Missouri Jane Doe, identified as Gwendolyn Renee Robinson. Gwendolyn Robinson was 20 years old and the mother of a young toddler when she went missing from Kansas City, Missouri. The last time anyone had seen her, she was applying for a marriage license on March 7, 1983. She seemingly just disappeared. Like so many of these men and women, if they were reported missing at the time, the evidence of the report went missing itself long ago. In many cases, the police wouldn't take a report, saying the missing person was an adult and they had a right to go missing if they wanted to. Personally, I think it's just an excuse not to take a report, but it happened in a lot of places, and it likely resulted in a lot of John and Jane Does. It's worth noting, though, that they no longer take that position today. They'll take the report, but it was common back then. Also, in a lot of these cases, family members seem to believe that they walked away on purpose, and then they're not actually missing. They're out there living their life by choice. In this case, Gwendolyn, she was a young mother, and her daughter never stopped caring or wondering where her mother was. She thought about her mother often as she grew up. She would end up putting in her own missing person report in the summer of 2022. The NamUs profile for her case was entered on August 8, 2022, and by September 8th, an announcement was made. Her daughter's missing person report gave her mother the incredible gift of having her name back, something all these men and women deserve. Gwendolyn was found on April 18, 1985, not quite 2 years after she went missing from Kansas City. At that time, she was in Clay County, not far away at all. Over the years, the police did search for her, and in fact, in a case I covered on this channel already once as an unidentified Jane Doe. The first examination led to them believe the Clay County Jane Doe was white, which most likely helped in keeping her from being identified early on. They did know that someone had shot 20-year-old Gwen in her skull multiple times and left her in a field where she was found near Boyer Road and Highway 210 East, near Missouri City. This was not quite 2 years and around 20 miles from where she was last seen. Authorities were thrilled when a tip was called in 2016. They saw the new recreation that was done, reflecting that she was a woman of color, and the person who called in the tip believed this was a co-worker who had mysteriously gone missing, saying they believed they worked with her and sometimes rode to work together. They believed that her name was Darlene, and she was a mother of 2, working at an envelope company. It was located in Kansas City. As soon as her daughter, who was now in her early 40s, reported her missing, it rapidly set things in motion. The detective working the case said he felt compelled to immediately try to help the daughter find any answers she could. This missing person report very much motivated him, and he pushed it forward. When she entered the police station to report her mother missing, he said he found her to be very authentic. He said it hit different. He felt like they had to dig into it. The police detective found himself drawn to the case, and interesting enough, she had passed away before he was even born. The detective would find himself working 12-hour days for a while, searching and interviewing people. It was he who contacted the analyst who would eventually find the Jane Doe case. In fact, it was a stroke of luck the analyst had a good memory for faces. He would state later that when he saw the picture of Gwendolyn, he immediately recognized her jawline. It goes to show just how important these recreations can be. And it likely helped there was a renewed effort in 2016 when the tip came in, keeping her image in mind. So it's possible the tip that Gwen may have been this woman named Darlene, while not true, may have actually made a huge difference. It could have been a blessing in disguise, and it helped that Gwen was found only 20 miles away from where she actually went missing. Everything fell together. They obtained and ran DNA tests comparing the Clay County Jane Doe to Gwendolyn's daughter. Eventually, it came back at a 50% match, indicating they were in fact mother and daughter. While Gwendolyn's daughter couldn't remember her mom, she very much wanted to find her. That drive for answers and a detective and an analyst that cared just as much made all the difference. Gwendolyn Robinson again had her name. I wish I could offer information on the father of Gwen's child, as it was he the marriage license was with, but so far there's nothing on this. I generally do another quick burst of research before I finalize the photos along with the audio, so if something comes up, you'll see an editor's note come up on the screen. Gwendolyn Renee Robinson was missing for 39 years. She went unidentified for 37. Had she lived, she would be 59 today. The Lady of the Dunes, identified as Ruth Marie Terry. The Lady of the Dunes is, in its own way, maybe the American version of Somerton Man. It was in July of 1974 that a 12-year-old girl was on the beach at Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Just yards from the road where she was chasing her dog who had run off, she saw the remains on a blanket of what she thought was a deer. It was soon discovered, however, that it wasn't a deer. It was a woman found lying on a blanket. The police originally believed she had been sleeping and someone took her life. There was no sign of a struggle, and she was laying to one side of the blanket as if perhaps someone shared the blanket next to her. Others surmised that she may have known the person who took her life, as there was no signs of a struggle. They were able to tell that she had her hair in a ponytail, a blue hairband, Wrangler jeans, and her toenails were painted pink. But it was problematic in the state her remains were in when she was found. 2 sets of footprints led to her remains, and tire tracks were found about 50 yards away. It appears whatever had happened 2 weeks before. It turns out it was so much worse than it appeared. She had been brutally strangled. One side of her head had been crushed. It appears that someone may have used a military-style entrenching tool. It was the head injury that would end up being determined to be the cause of death. Whoever left there had removed her hands, leading the police to believe that she may have had fingerprints somewhere that would have linked to her identity. They believed she was about 5'8" and 145 pounds, and they were able to tell she'd had a lot of expensive dental work done that was about $10,000. They would state the style of dental care was New York style. Some of her teeth had been removed post-mortem. She was likely 20 to 49, and there was also a sign of SA that took place post-mortem, likely caused by a foreign object. The case investigators helped raise money for her burial casket, and then, over the years, the case would go cold, but not for lack of trying. Depictions of her were created in 1979. Another was done in 2006. The police searched missing person cases in hopes of finding one that would match, but it never happened. Many believed that Whitey Bulger was involved, as he'd been seen with a woman resembling the Lady of the Dunes. The case took on a mysterious air. For anyone who doesn't know, Whitey Bulger was 45 at the time, and he was a really bad guy. He was an Irish mob boss located in Boston. For many years, he would rank under the top 10 of the FBI's most wanted. The link between them was never proved, however, and it's unlikely but not impossible that he was involved. A man named Hayden Clark, who would be convicted of 2 other murders, confessed to the Lady of the Dunes, but that is also thought to be a false lead. Authorities would eventually say that this statement was believed to be untrue. In 2015, Joe Hill, who was the son of author Stephen King, introduced the theory that the Lady of the Dunes may have been an extra on the 1975 film Jaws, which was filmed in the Massachusetts area during the summer of 1974. And in fact, a lot of people from that area were extras in the movie. This theory was spawned when Hill attended a 40th anniversary screening of Steven Spielberg's movie Jaws. This movie was filmed on Martha's Vineyard in the summer of 1974. The Vineyard is an island off the south of Cape Cod, and the movie was filmed nearby. He spotted in the movie a woman who he thought looked exactly like the 2010 composite recreation of the Lady of the Dunes. And this theory began to take on life. The authorities have called it wild speculation, but comments online were rampant. Hill commented that it was commonly known that a lot of people were around Cape Cod at that time that had appeared in the movie. Personally, at first, I decided it didn't appear like a close match, but then looking at it again, I'm not so sure. With it blown up, it does look a lot like her, especially the depiction of her with short hair. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was it her? Was she in the movie? It would take Othaniel Labs to make her identification on October 31st, 2022. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry, but she had used multiple aliases over time, and that may have had something to do with the trouble in identifying her. Terry was also known as Terry Marie Vizina, Terry M. Vizina, Terry Shannon, and we know that she was 37 when she was killed in 1974. She had married a man named Guy Rockwell Muldaven in 1974, and he was a known criminal who had the tendency to use multiple aliases himself. Ruth was 37 when her life was taken. It's unclear if she'd ever been arrested, but he had. In fact, by the time he married Ruth, he was already under suspicion for taking the life of his second wife and stepdaughter in 1960. He had been named as one of the prime suspects in Ruth's case. I decided it might be important to run down what we know about Moldaven, because the police are looking for people to call in with information that might concretely end up solving this case. We know that Moldaven was an antiques dealer who used the names Raoul Guy Rockwell and Guy Moldaven. He was born in 1923, and he attended school in Switzerland, New York, and Connecticut. He was married to his first wife for 10 years, and then he later married a woman named Manzi Ryan, who disappeared on April Fool's Day, 1960, along with her 18-year-old daughter, and they were never seen again. The same goes for that case. If anyone has any information on that case, please call the number that will show up at the end of this video on the screen. Adding insult to injury, he divorced wife number 2 for abandoning him. The police went through his house and they did find human tissue and some body parts, they said, in a newly sealed septic tank. Then somehow Moldaven disappeared, along with a check that he was given from his wife's stepmother for $10,000. The money in today's currency would be worth $99,000. It was meant to buy some antiquities for quick resale in Canada, but instead he pocketed the money and ran. We know that the Erie Pacific Times in 1961 printed a story stating he was suspected in the deaths of the second wife and daughter. And according to that story, he'd fled to Seattle, and he was arrested by the FBI in Brooklyn, New York in December of 1960. He was charged with unlawful flight to avoid giving testimony relating to the mutilation of human remains. It also stated that he was facing larceny charges for cheating wife number 3's family out of the $10,000. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to no more than 15 years. He was required to repay the money. Doesn't appear he was ever charged with the death of wife number 2, and I don't know how much time he served. What feels almost unforgivable about this case is that most of it happened so long ago that the odds of solving it are minimal, and the odds anyone is even still alive. It's just profoundly unfair that somebody loses their life and the person who does it goes free, and there's no punishment. Moldaven died in 2002 in California, and according to his obituary, he had married for the 5th time. Moldaven had actually been profiled in 1985 on a radio show in Pacific Grove. He was respected and he had a lot of friends. But the weird thing is, in that radio show, he mentioned the topic of erosion of culture. And he would make the statement that he believed killing had become a habit, which is ironic given all the suspicions that now lay around him. He moved on to the West Coast and managed to move on like his past didn't even matter. All of the suspicions were left behind. One of his newer friends came forward to say he was shocked that any of this was possible. He thought Moldaven was a stand-up guy. While his former wife was a Jane Doe in a Massachusetts cemetery plot, Moldaven continued to forge new relationships and a new life on the West Coast. He married Phyllis Roper, who was listed as his widow in the 2002 obituary. Phyllis herself died last year. It's believed that Terry lived in Massachusetts, Tennessee, and California, and possibly Michigan. It might be hard after all these years to trace her, but if at all possible, please call the number on the screen. Ruth Marie Terry went unidentified for 48 years. Unidentified Jane Doe. The Riverside County Jane Doe, 1996. I was contacted by a relative of the Riverside Jane Doe, 1996. Cecilia found herself being contacted by a person who was doing genetic DNA research for this specific case. It turns out she was related, but she didn't know who this woman was. While she didn't know of anyone in her family that was missing, her DNA still may help solve the puzzle. That's why it's so important to upload your DNA. The story starts on January 27th, 1996, about 20 feet south of the eastbound 60 freeway. This was about a mile and a half east of Gilman Springs Road. The remains of a woman was found near some trash in a hilly area off Highway 60 near Beaumont, California. The woman was wearing a purple, long-sleeved turtleneck shirt, blue pants, and a dark gray sweater. Her clothing was clean and well maintained, so she likely wasn't homeless. The same goes for her dental care. She'd received dental care, and she was wearing quite a bit of jewelry, including a yellow metal wristwatch with a flower-shaped cover. It had multiple stones on top, with a red one in the center. There was what was described as a yellow metal ring with a clear stone on her left ring finger, and what's described as a gold pendant in the shape of a rose. I'm certainly not an expert, but I once had a Black Hills gold ring in the shape of a rose, and it looked exactly like this, which makes me think this could be Black Hills gold. There was also a necklace with what is described as gold Jesus and Virgin Mary pendant. Homicide investigators responded to the scene 26 years ago, finding her just hours after she passed due to a GS wound to the head. She suffered extensive trauma, and as a result, she wasn't visually identifiable. She was of Hispanic descent, and the two names that came up the most in her genetic DNA search was the surnames of Rivera and Duran, with Rivera being the one that came up the most. Her line of ancestors appeared to have mainly originated in Durango, Mexico, eventually migrating to the United States, mostly within California. They believe the young woman was likely 30 to 45, which, if correct, would likely mean someone within the Rivera or Duran families are missing someone with a birth date ranging from about 1951 to 1966. She was around 5'1" and 130 pounds. They also noted that she'd had at least one child, as she had a cesarean scar. If anyone has any idea who she might be, please call the contact number on the screen or submit an anonymous tip. The tip link is given on the screen. The Riverside Jane Doe, 1996, has gone unidentified for 26 years. The Baca County Jane Doe, identified as Nora Castillo. In the summer of 1988, a skeleton was discovered on farmland near the city of Springfield, Colorado, in Baca County, by a farmer who owned the land. She was located in an open field, and the area itself was heavily traveled by truckers who liked to go that way in order to avoid the port of entry for Colorado. It was an open secret that this was the way you could go. Unfortunately, by the time she'd been found, her bones had been sun-bleached, which makes DNA so much more difficult. Although, of course, in 1988, DNA wasn't even a consideration. That would come later. Most of her remains were found, and it was determined she had a quarter with her that was minted in 1986. The report I'm seeing says they believe she had been there 1 to 3 years. It just shows sometimes how much things conflict, because if you look at the quarter, it couldn't be more than 2 years, unless the quarter came from someone else. Dental impressions were made and dental records were submitted to the National Crime Information Center, but there were never any hits. DNA was taken later, and there was a recreation done. They stated she was likely of Hispanic or Native American heritage, and they believed she had never given birth. It wasn't true. Nora Castillo was identified in November of 2022, and while she was of Hispanic heritage, she had given birth. There was a daughter out there that was trying to find what happened to her mother. Nora went missing in either 1986 or 1987. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation reached out to the Sheriff's Office in May of 2021, requesting that they submit evidence from the 1988 Jane Doe case into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Systems, or NamUs. Nora's daughter had reported her missing in 1996. They didn't exhume Nora Castillo until much later, finally exhuming her in December of 2021 in order to get DNA. DNA was never taken for whatever reason, perhaps because they couldn't successfully do it back then. They eventually got a workable DNA profile, and it was uploaded to NamUs, and it matched that of her daughter. Nora Castillo had made a collect phone call to her parents from Colorado around 1986 or 1987, and that was the last time they'd heard from her. I wish I could tell you about her daughter and that she had a good life, but there isn't anything online so far. I know I always hoped that they did. Nora Castillo went unidentified for 34 years. The Los Angeles John Doe, 1999, identified as Edward Michael Weber. This Los Angeles John Doe was renting an apartment at the Frontier Hotel in Los Angeles, California. He passed away at that hotel, either without a name or with an alias, and he unfortunately wasn't found for several days. They estimated he was about 60 to 70 years old. If his cause of death was determined, it wasn't released. The entire case is just sad because outside of the photo that came back from his fingerprint, which was successfully processed in November of 2022, no one has come forward to claim his remains. I've included his name as profile and the phone number needed in order for somebody to claim him. Edward Michael Weber has gone unidentified for 22 years. Alpharetta John Doe, identified as William Lee Carter. William Lee Carter was 49 when he went missing on August 21st, 2010. There isn't a lot of information online about this case, but it's clear that Willie, as he liked to be called, was reported missing by someone. Flyers were also uploaded to NamUs in 2013, stating that Willie was missing and that he had a seizure disorder, and it lists that he was last seen in Roswell, Georgia. In early 2022, a suggestion was submitted to the Doe Network by a user regarding a possible match with the John Doe found in Alpharetta, Georgia. The Doe was found on December 30th, 2011. Partial remains were found in a wooded area near the Bluegrass Valley Parkway in Alpharetta, Georgia. It was pretty amazing that there was even a suggestion, as there was no recreation at all. All that was found was a black and white Nike Air sneakers that are displayed here, along with a brown leather belt and Levi jeans. The Roswell police would eventually confirm it was Willie. There wasn't a lot of information, so I considered not covering it, but like several of the others I covered this time, Willie still hasn't been claimed. Someone cared about him enough to make a report, but his name as profile is still up. I hope someone changes that. Willie and those like him deserve more. We all do. Names and respect. William Lee Carter went unidentified for 10 years. The Astoria John Doe, identified as Leslie Page Hickman. Leslie Hickman was born in 1942, and he grew up in Washington County and Grants Pass, Oregon. After high school, he would move on his own to Portland and sometimes spend time in Umatilla, which is about 200 miles east of the Portland area. He'd been working as a landscaper, and because of this, he traveled a lot. And it further complicated the situation for his family when he disappeared in late 1967 or early 1968. He would likely have been 25 at the time. His family didn't even know how to pinpoint where it was he disappeared. He just suddenly stopped contacting them. Unbeknownst to his family, about 36 years after Leslie disappeared, the remains of a man were found in Tillamook State Forest off Highway 26 in October of 2004. There's no reason they would have ever have guessed it was Leslie. In addition to the time lapse, no recreation was ever made, and the cause of death couldn't be determined. It would take DNA, which eventually pointed to the missing man. His family confirmed he had been missing since the late 60s. How he ended up there and why is still a mystery, one that might not be solved unless people come forward to say what he was doing at the time. The number is found on your screen. Anything known, even minor, might be helpful. Leslie Hickman was missing for 55 years. He was an unidentified John Doe for almost 18. Leslie passed away at 25. Had he lived, he'd be 80 years old today. The Benton County John Doe, identified as John Rollins Jr. In October of 1996, a man was found in Beaver Lake near the area of Montagny, Arkansas, which is a community in the Ozark Mountains. He quickly called 911, and the Benton County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. They knew the man was either a weightlifter or had a job requiring hard labor. He had abnormal bone growth on his right arm. He was also likely a heavy smoker or coffee drinker. He was found zipped inside a sleeping bag that contained 2 pillows and was filled with foam, originating from the Washington Regional Center. It would also be determined that someone had brutally assaulted him, and it was that assault that resulted in his death, before abandoning him in the nearby lake. They knew very little about the man, and eventually they worked to fund an exam at the University of Arkansas to see if there was anything new that could be determined. To that point, they weren't even sure of his age. On April 3, 1998, a facial reconstruction was done and then released, in hopes that someone would recognize him. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to his identification. On September 18, 2008, portions of his remains were sent to the University of North Texas in hopes they would offer usable DNA. They were able to offer a partial mitochondrial DNA profile, and this was entered into NamUs. No matches were found, however, and comparing dental x-rays with missing men from the area offered nothing. So again, in 2019, the Benton County Sheriff's Office contacted the Arkansas Crime Lab in hopes more could be done. So many of these cases include mistakes by the police and not following through, but that's not the case here. They clearly did everything they could to give him back his name. They wanted the crime lab to use forensic genealogy to uncover it, but the lab was clear that that wasn't an option, not from them anyway. Then enter Othram Labs. In March of 2021, they reached out and were encouraged to send testable portions of his remains. Like much of this case, it wasn't easy, but while it took multiple times to get usable DNA, Othram did it. And then on October 28, 2021, they got a working DNA profile. And they had some matches. By June 29, 2022, they had reached out to a family member, but the man didn't know anyone who was missing. He didn't know who it could be. They interviewed him as best they could and then requested DNA samples from others within his tree to try to narrow it down. By September 17, 2022, their work arrived at a family that listed a son as deceased in an obituary. It was pretty good work by the genealogists because they tried to confirm whether or not this was in fact John Rollins Jr., who happened to have an obituary online. They searched Social Security records, and it was clear nobody was using his Social Security number. After inquiries were made, his family would explain that no police report was ever filed, but John Rollins Jr. had been missing since the mid-1990s, and they believed he was no longer alive, thus the obituary. And so there was hope that they finally knew what happened to John. More DNA was requested, and with this, John Rollins Jr. officially had his name again. John was 31 when he was last seen by his family in 1995. Unfortunately, there's still no indication of who took his life, and that's where those who knew him come in. Someone who worked with him or perhaps was friends with him might have answers that are needed. Even small details can make the difference. I provided email and phone numbers if anyone has any information. John Rollins Jr. was missing for 27 years. He was a John Doe for 26. If he was alive today, he would be 58. The Benton County Jane Doe, identified as Donna Sue Nelton. On May 7, 1990, 8 miles west of Decatur, Arkansas, off Highway 102, near the town of Rogers, a woman was found with what appeared to be buckshot in the ground below her. It would later be determined that someone had set the woman on fire and run over her, likely in an attempt to block identification. It worked too, at least for a while. The damage was too much to even allow a recreation. A neighbor would report seeing a fire in the area of February 1990, but he didn't bother to check it out, and he figured someone was just burning trash. Thanks to Othram Labs, she once again has a name. Donna Sue Nelton was last seen in the fall of 1989. Unrelated to her missing persons case, the federal authorities were already investigating her boyfriend at the time, George Alvin Bruton. George Bruton was not a good guy. He'd spent time on the FBI Most Wanted list for 3 months in 1979, after taking 2 families hostage in Utah. He ended up wounding several police officers in that same event. He was a suspect in several murders in Kansas City, Missouri. and he had convictions for bank robbery, burglary, and auto theft. He was finally detained when he was wounded and captured after a shootout that took place in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He seemed all along like the best bet as to the person who took her life. He was paroled and released in 1988, but he kept committing more crimes. For this reason, he was under investigation again in July of 1989. It caused him to be under surveillance, and in September of 1989, he was seen throwing trash bags away in North Kansas City, Missouri. The police then pulled back the bags and checked inside, and inside them was everything that belonged to Donna. Shortly after, Donna's car was discovered inside a storage unit, but there were no signs of Donna herself. They were pretty sure he had done something to her, but there was no proof, and he was back and forth from prison. There was a probation violation in 90, and an allegation that he was leading a multi-state drug ring. Why they kept letting him go is beyond me. He has always been the suspected reason for Donna's disappearance, and in July of 1990 there was finally a lead. An anonymous source told the FBI that he had confessed to killing Donna, saying that she stood up to him and threatened to expose his drug and theft crimes. The person would go on to state that her remains were believed to be on land owned by Bruton in Ozark County, Missouri. They took this lead seriously, and they spent 4 days searching for her remains, but they didn't find them. Her family would tell investigators she was known to be with Bruton when they passed through Benton, Arkansas. A lot of time and effort went into trying to find Donna. We know now that on May 7th, 1990, 2 months prior to their search for Donna's grave in Ozark County, she had actually been found in Decatur, Arkansas, which is about 150 miles away. There was no indication, sadly, that it was her. It would take 32 years to discover that she had finally been found, and that had happened almost immediately. Bruton's not alive anymore, but he got 18 more years on this earth than Donna. He died in prison in 2008, where he landed after being found guilty on drug charges. Donna was just 28 when her life was taken. She would be around 60 today. Donna went unidentified for 32 years. The Garfield John Doe, identified as Jamie Grow. It was June 13, 1981, when male remains were found in a grassy area located about 1/2 mile east of Garland, Arkansas, off Highway 62 East. The man had likely been in the field for 2 to 3 weeks. He was partially hidden by underbrush near the railroad tracks. He was wearing gray and green trousers, a t-shirt, blue and orange striped jogging shoes, and a cloth headband. He appeared to have red to blonde hair and was maybe 5'9" to 6 feet. He was likely in his 20s to early 30s. The man appeared to have had serious health challenges. He had a larger than normal head as a result of having a buildup of fluid within his brain. The excess fluid would put pressure on his brain, and it had been treated by drilling holes in his skull. Those examining him believed this may have led to a mild intellectual challenge. They had hoped the very specific facts that were now known would help identify him, but it wasn't the case. They were able to tell he'd been shot 4 times at close range, and he was left where he was found. 28 years later, in June of 2009, the police entered the man into the NamUs database, which is the National Missing and Unidentified Person database. Sadly, there were no hits on who he might have been. They would periodically take a look again at the case to see if anything new happened that they could identify. They attempted to extract usable DNA, but it failed. That wasn't fully unexpected, as it was only recent years that the advances in DNA have helped with identification. It was decided in January of 2019 they would re-examine all the evidence from the crime scene. The Arkansas Crime Lab indicated they were willing to do what they could. That is, if the man's remains could be found, they would do DNA. It turns out there was some trouble finding where he was located. As horrible as that is, this is not the first time I've reported this, or the second, or the third. Eventually, they did locate him in an unmarked grave in the Bentonville Cemetery. It amazes me how many of these people were buried in unmarked graves. Now that they found him, they determined a private lab would be able to do genetic genealogy, and Otham Labs did. By July of 2022, the in-house team had identified a close familial match. And by August, they were in contact with the relative. And that man knew exactly who was missing. The next step is always to compare DNA from the closest match possible. They did so, and it was positive. On October 25th, 2022, it was announced that Fred James Grow once again had his name. It would turn out he was unidentified for 41 years, and that was longer than he'd been alive. Fred Grow, who went by the name of Jamie, was 33 years old, and he had planned a trip from Fayetteville, Arkansas, that should have taken him to Kansas City, Missouri, and then to Wichita, Kansas, and then on to Colorado to see family. Except for that trip didn't happen. All his family knew was that he never arrived at any of those planned destinations, but they weren't quite sure where he disappeared. It's believed that Jamie was approached by two females who were in need of a ride to Oregon. A witness came forward to say that Jamie had agreed to give them a ride part of the way to Kansas City. Jamie was then driving a 1965 Ford Econoline camper van. Witnesses placed the two women in the vehicle, whose names they were able to provide. His movements couldn't be traced at all once they left Fayetteville. We know they knew quite a bit about this case, including the person believed to have taken Jamie's life. Jamie's body was located near U.S. Route 62, which is about a half-mile east of Garfield, and that's about 40 miles from his home in Fayetteville. He didn't make it very far. The police have made a statement that they believe they know who took his life. The story is a little bit convoluted, however, because it includes a statement that he was likely a homeless man who was helping the convicted killer transport drugs from Bentonville to New York City. And from everything I can see, I don't think that was true. For whatever reason, it was taken as a statement of fact from the informant, mostly because the informant recalled John Doe's large head and had described some of the clothing. It's unclear what happened to Jamie's van, or if it ever showed up again. It appears the women were in some way involved with the man who took Jamie's life. The informant told police he had been hired to kill one of the women, and whatever transpired, no one really knows, but the woman didn't die, and Jamie did. The woman survived, and the suspect was indicted. The Barry County Sheriff questioned the man about the assault against the woman on October 26, 1981, about 4 months after Jamie's remains were found. He confessed to the assault against the female who had been traveling with Jamie, and the next day that man took his own life. He did, however, leave a note identifying who hired him. They have been unable to arrest the man, however, saying they don't have enough evidence. Jamie Grow went unidentified for 41 years. 8 years longer than he was allowed to live. He was 33 years old when his life was taken in 1981. If he'd lived, he would be 74 today. The Brazoria County Jane Doe, identified as Alisha Marie Cooks, who went by the name of Lisa. On December 16, 1985, like way too many men and women before her, a Jane Doe was found when two hunters discovered skeletal remains near Peatland, Texas, approximately 50 yards east of the intersection of County Road 59 and County Road 94. The woman found wore a size small. She had a square-faced watch with a maroon leather band and HIS brand blue jeans with a 28-inch inseam. They believed her to be 17 to 26 and maybe 5'6" tall. The cause of death was a GS wound to the head. Over the years, a number of recreations were done, but no one came forward. They did, however, have DNA on file. As mentioned in some other videos, a family member should always submit their DNA to NamUs if they're missing somebody. It's the first place the John and Jane Doe DNA is uploaded to. In this case, there was a positive match right away. The Brazoria County Jane Doe was Lisa Cooks. She was 16 when she disappeared from Houston, Texas. For the last 36 years, she was only 20 miles away from home. The person who did this has never been charged and is still being sought by the police. Lisa Cooks went unidentified for 37 years. The Cape Girardeau County John Doe, identified as Everette Guy Travis. In April of 1981, the remains of a man were found by a mushroom hunter just off Interstate 55 near Oak Ridge, Missouri. They were skeletal, and an analysis at the time indicated a male of European descent who stood approximately 5'10" and was between 20 and 40 years old. Not all of his remains were found. His skull wasn't recovered until 1988. It was found in the same general area. They did find clothing. He'd been wearing green pants, a khaki shirt, black loafers, and they were adorned with a metal buckle. He died from a GS wound from a small caliber. Initial attempts at extracting DNA and developing an STR profile were unsuccessful. There were problems getting usable DNA, though eventually a mitochondrial DNA profile was entered into CODIS. This profile, however, can't be used for genetic genealogy. They ran an isotope test, and they did some testing to see if they could get an SNP profile, which would be suitable then to search for his family. It worked, and the amazing thing is they got a match right away, a sibling match. And once again, Everette Guy Travis had his name. It turns out Everett was a 26-year-old Air Force veteran when he went missing in 1977. He was known in his family for being a bit of a good Samaritan, and he tried to constantly help others in need. He had picked up a hitchhiker named Kenneth Daring in Blytheville in June of 1977. Witnesses had come forward at the time, saying they saw Daring speaking to Everett. That was the last time he was ever seen. Shortly after this, Kenneth Daring was caught trying to sell Everett's vehicle in Sikeston, Missouri. The person to whom Daring was trying to sell it contacted the authorities. The man was behaving very oddly, and in the car were Everett's belongings as well as a firearm. More than one witness came forward at the time. Daring had even confessed to taking the life of Everett, but he would give different accounts of where the remains were, and so they couldn't recover them. This is one of the more rare cases where a man was tried without a body. I know we've had discussions on this before on here, but let me know what you think. Should someone be tried without a body? It seems like usually the consensus is no, although honestly I think in this case it was a pretty good call. Kenneth Daring was convicted of taking Everett's life. He died in prison in 2012 without ever telling the truth about what happened, and funding for this case was provided by donors to the Southeast Missouri State University Foundation. Everette Guy Travis was missing for 45 years, and he was an unidentified John Doe for 41. He was just 26 when his life was taken. Had he lived, he'd be 71 today. Stilly Doe, identified as Othaniel Ames. Othaniel Philip Ames was a dairyman from Arlington, Washington. He was born in the Midwest on August 23, 1898. He went by the name of Odie. Odie had been in poor health, but he didn't let it get him down, and while he was 82 and suffering from heart disease, he just kept going. He told everyone he was taking a trip in 1980, and he never returned home. His family had no idea what happened to Odie. The same year, Spencer Fuentes was just a teenage boy. He found a body when he was fly fishing in a nearby river in 1980 near his home in Savannah, Washington. There was a man caught in a log jam in the nearby river, and so he ran to a neighbor to call the police, but the sheriff's deputy who responded was less than impressed. He said he didn't believe it was actually a body because no one had been reported missing, and he didn't want to bother to go get it, but Mr. Fuentes was insistent, and the deputy finally agreed. He traipsed out into the river and was only gone a few moments before he came back saying, "Yep, that's a body." The man that was found was wearing Winthrop dress shoes with arch supports made of leather, metal, and paper. They believed he'd been there for a few months. He was wearing a belt buckle with the initials GRN on it. The police were unable to identify the man, and no one with those initials had gone missing. They believed he likely was of Native American descent. An autopsy would be done, and there were no signs of trauma, nor did the man drown. It was believed he passed from natural causes. His age was difficult to narrow down, but they thought he was likely 30, maybe to 70, which is pretty wide. They said he was around 5'6" with poor dental health. The best clue to his identity seemed to be the initials on the belt buckle, the red GRN. But the buckle wasn't buried with the man, and it doesn't seem to exist anymore, so there's still some questions about those initials. A decade later, Odie's daughter-in-law, Margaret Ames, would move back to Savannah, Washington with her husband. She would meet and become friends with Spencer Fuentes through a local Lutheran church. In fact, she would frequently go blueberry picking on their farm, which was pretty near to where Odie was found. But because that's not a conversation one would expect to have with each other, Margaret had no idea that Spencer had found the remains of a man a decade before. Nor did Margaret mention her missing father-in-law. After all, a decade had passed, and no one believed that Odie was still alive, because of how old he was when he disappeared. 42 years would pass without Odie's family having any idea what happened to him. Snohomish County had been working hard in recent years with Othram Labs to identify all of the John and Jane Does from the area. Out of a dozen cases, only 4 remain. And with this, Odie again had his name. Stilly John Doe was actually Othaniel Philip Ames, who was 82 at the time. And now his daughter-in-law Margaret is almost the exact same age as Odie was when he went missing. The authorities confirmed the man's name at a press conference in November of 2022. They would explain that he was a dairyman from the Midwest and that Margaret's friend Spencer had found Odie all those years ago. I grabbed myself, she said, and I thought, oh my God, Spencer. He was a teenager. He's now in his 50s. Odie's daughter-in-law knew that Odie had lost touch with his family around 1980, but she never guessed. A few months before he was found, it was mentioned that he was going on a trip. She would go on to say, there have been many times when I thought about Odie and whatever happened to him, so this has brought some closure to me, and she thanked everybody. She said finally they were able to fill in some blanks. Odie was 20 when the United States entered World War I. His Army registration card was stamped in Bonesteel, South Dakota. Bonesteel had a population of 600 at the time, and Odie, like many of the other young men at the time, left to find ways to earn money. His name never came up in the draft, and Bonesteel slowly got smaller and smaller. He would go on to marry Lydia Newth in 1929. Lydia was 29 and he was 31. Just months later, the stock market crashed, and life became even harder than normal. By then, they were living in another tiny town, that of Cottonwood, South Dakota. By 1936, Odie had several kids and another on the way. The young family would make their way to Washington, and Lydia gave birth to their son later in the new home. They would go on to have one more boy. In the end, they had 2 boys and 2 girls. By the time World War I came around, he was 43, and he again avoided being drafted. His draft card states he was self-employed. The boy born to him shortly after the move was Walter, and he would serve in the armed forces, entering the Air Force. He would go on and marry a young woman who had grown up in Savannah, which is just 6 miles away from where Odie went missing. That was Margaret, and Margaret would explain that all 4 of Odie's kids have since passed, but she had a number of keepsakes, including photos of Odie, as does his grandniece. She has letters written by Odie's wife, Lydia, asking one of the kids how the land in western Washington was, before they even moved out there. Odie and his boys later built farm buildings on the land, and they had 7 dairy cows that they would milk multiple times a day. This was all done by hand, and Lydia worked hard cooking for everybody on a wood stove. Odie also made some money fashioning wood, salt, and pepper shakers. Things were hard back then, but they were happy. Odie would continue with his cows, and he also worked at a shingle mill. He enjoyed making dandelion wine in his spare time, and his grandniece still has his handwritten recipe. She would describe him as being a typical farmer. He was hard-working and he could be stern, but he was a good man. Where Lydia was quiet, Odie was boisterous. The couple would separate in the 1960s, but they never divorced. There was some upset in the house when the 2 boys went into the armed services. They did this when they were just teenagers. One of the daughters died only 10 years after her high school graduation. She was actually on the way to her 10-year reunion when it happened. The Ames family eventually sold off the farm, and while the 2 didn't divorce, they went their separate ways. Lydia moved to Everett, Washington, and Odie moved to a small cabin in the woods near Arlington, Washington, that didn't even have indoor plumbing. It's possible he knew what was coming because his niece Diane saw him around early 1980, and she said he wasn't doing very well. He was coughing a lot, but he refused to go to a doctor. He said he'd worked outside all of his life, and he had no desire to be cooped up anywhere. Before he disappeared, he gave Diane and her husband his old car, which was worth probably just a few $100s, whispering to her that inside there was a $20 emergency fund hidden that she could access if needed. He also gave them an old vintage gun. She would say there was no known reason for him giving these things away. Her sister-in-law thought later that maybe it was because he had been invited to Diane's wedding not long before, and she was on his mind. Around that same time, he gave a family Bible to a different niece. She knew the date it happened because it was inscribed in the dedication page. He also gave the deed to his cabin to a nursing student who lived nearby. Othaniel Philip Ames went unidentified for 42 years. He was 82 when he passed away. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. So if you enjoy the content here and you're not sure, take a peek to see if you're subscribed. Take care of yourselves and each other.